Good morning. No high chair this week. You can turn to Romans if you'd like. We're going to spend this week continuing our exploration of Romans 14 and 15. Paul has let us know, to this point in Romans, that he has a dream. That he dreams about the unified, multi-ethnic family of God. But the churches that he's writing to in Rome are not exactly fulfilling that dream. They're struggling with division. And Paul's basic message for them, his antidote for their division, is that they would all die to themselves. He gets this from the death of Jesus. Like all of this church stuff to Paul is not about my rights or your heritage or whatever it is. It's about following Jesus in his humiliation. That's what he's getting at in Romans. If you remember from last week, and Ken, the clickers, as it is consistently inconsistent, continuing to do that. If you remember from last week, this is kind of a brief glimpse at the book of Romans. The first part of the book explores a death cycle. It explores what it looks like for humans to be spiritually dead. In the beginning, or in the middle of the book, Paul explores how we find life by going through death. And again, he gets this from Jesus, how Jesus found life and gives all of us life through death. And the last part of the book, which is where we're spending our time this morning, is a life cycle. It's what it looks like for humans to be spiritually alive, spiritually together in a church as the unified, multi-ethnic family of God. Our title for this morning is Afraid of Our Love. Afraid of Our Love. I say this because there's almost nothing that's scarier than death, right? We've all experienced it to some extent in our lives. There's almost nothing that's scarier than death, and in this case, dying to yourself. Afraid of our love. And this is actually a reference, some of you will know who this is. This is Steve Carell playing a character in the show The Office. And there's a scene in the show where Steve Carell, I think he asks himself, if I remember right, would you rather be feared or loved? He's the boss of The Office. Would you rather be feared or loved? He says, the answer is easy. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. So that's his way around this deep philosophical dilemma, feared or loved. I want them to be afraid of how much they love me. And I think, and if we're taking it to the Bible, I think that's Paul's antidote to their division. It's to be afraid of how much they love each other, of what they're willing to give up for each other. Because these churches are divided over things that really matter to them. Like they are divided over these boundary markers of deeply held religious and spiritual and cultural practices. But Paul's message to them so far in chapter 14, if you're there, you can look at Romans 14, verses 7 and 13, but the verses should all be behind me as well. This is kind of a summary of what he said to this point. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. So Paul's basic message is that we are all in this church thing together. So get over yourselves is kind of the point of what he's saying here. But that's not how they've been operating. The Roman church has divided itself, or churches have divided themselves into two basic groups. We're going to switch sides. Last week, this side was the weak, this side the strong. So we're going to switch. This side is going to be the weak this week. So one side of the Roman churches, Paul calls the weak. The other side, he calls the strong. Last week, we talked about the spiritual side of this situation, how the Jewish Christians in Rome were the weak because they believe the gospel, right? They believe that they are accepted in God, in Christ, that Jesus has fulfilled God's commands. But they haven't quite managed to let that belief spread to every nook and cranny of their lives. Because they're holding on to these unnecessary rules. If you're reading in Romans, it's referring to like the Sabbath days and the Jewish feast days and the kosher diet. They're holding on to these rules that God's people have indeed practiced for thousands of years at this point. But they're holding on to them because they give them a sense of spiritual security. They help them to feel safe. They help them to feel like they have a right to be here doing this. So they're holding on to those. But the strong, in Paul's language, the Gentile, the non-Jewish Christians, they have no problems with these rules. They are just fine eating their barbecue, and they're happy about it, right? They're enjoying it. So they are spiritually strong. And Paul's conclusion to all of this, and this is breaking new ground from last week, but Paul's conclusion is verses 17 and 19. The kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. So then, let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. So for Paul, we don't fight about the food that we eat, the holidays that we observe, whatever that is. We don't fight about that. We fight about peace and joy and righteousness. We're not fighting with each other or against each other. We're fighting for each other. That's Paul's message here. And last week, he kind of got on to this side of the room. Sorry, guys, but he got on to the weak Christians for condemning their brothers and sisters with stronger consciences. Like, as we're reading through Romans 14, Paul kind of shows his cards. He says, like, yes, this side of the room is right. Like, the steak that you're eating is fine. In Jesus, it's fine. So, y'all, technically speaking, need to get over condemning this other side of the room. But his big message is all y'all need to get over yourselves. Not all y'all, but the people in Rome need to get over yourselves, right? So that's his message in Romans 14. But specifically, he's kind of picking on the weak. He's saying, y'all need to stop condemning these people for doing something that they're free to do in Jesus. But this week, he turns it on the strong. He turns to the other side of the room. I just realized this side of the room is getting picked on 2 weeks in a row. Sorry for that. Paul's vision for this church in this moment wasn't necessarily like a perfect reconciliation where they're all singing Kumbaya around a fire. Maybe that's the end goal. But that's not the triage in the moment that Paul is going for. Because there's more than just spiritual fitness at work here. There are more dynamics at play. There's another area in which the Jewish Christians are weak and the Gentile Christians are strong. If you remember last week, we talked about how a few years before this, the Jews, all the Jews, had been kicked out of Rome by the emperor, right? So they've been kicked out. A few years later, they're let back in. So now they're back in, but they're still at a very vulnerable place, right? As a group, they're back in, but they're still kind of outcasts. That's what happens when an entire group of people is kicked out. So, socially speaking, like in their society, the Gentiles in these Christians, or in these churches, had all of the leverage. They were the strong, socially speaking. And that brings us to Romans 15 and verse 1. Paul says, "We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves." Now, there's more going on here than may meet the eye. Because on the surface, this seems like a continuation from Romans 14, right? You still have the weak, you still have the strong. But there's something different happening here. There's more at play. On the screen, we have the words weak and strong and weak again. Something different about Romans 15 from Romans 14 is that the word strong never actually appeared in Romans 14. Paul was talking about the same group of people, but he never called them the strong per se. People say that because they are the same group of people from chapter to chapter, but this is a new distinction. So, the strong in Romans 15, but also the weak in Romans 15. Weak is a different word in Romans 15 than in Romans 14. And they're on the screen just so you can see that I'm not I guess I made this PowerPoint, so maybe I am totally making it up. But hopefully you can see that I'm not totally making it up. These are actual Greek words, and they're different words in Romans 14, Romans 15, translated as weak for us. Now, if you notice this word strong and the word weak in Romans 15, If you notice, they're very similar, right? In fact, they're the same word, just with an A on the beginning of the word translated weak. And we do the same thing in English. A theist is someone who believes that God exists. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe that God exists, right? So this is the same thing that's happening here. The strong, the powerful are dunatos. The weak are dunatos, right? So they have the A in front of it. It's negating. So the groups that we're talking about are still the same. The weak are still the Jewish Christians, and the strong are still the Gentile Christians. But there's something different at play here, because they're not spiritually weak and spiritually strong in this case. It's social. It's about status in their context. So he's saying that those of you who have status, who have power, who have privilege, it's up to you. It's up to you to go out of your way to make sure that the people without status feel equal or are treated as equals in the family of God. He places this burden in Romans 15 and verse 1 on the strong, on those with status. Now, this may be a totally new way of thinking about church for you as people with and without status. I don't know. It might be. And if it is, it might be that you are the person with status, if it is totally new to you. At least for me, this is just from my very limited experience. But the places in my life where I have status, I've slowly been discovering are also the places where I am most blind to the fact that other people don't have that same status. I don't know if you found that as well, but the areas in my life where I have status are the areas where I'm most blind to the fact that other people don't have what I have there. So if I'm someone with status in a community of people, in a country, whatever it is, in a church, then I need to realize the power that affords me, power for good or for evil. This is some of what Paul is getting at here in Romans 15, that having status gives a certain kind of power that not having status does not give. So, I have a list here of things we can go through to help us identify my level of status, especially in our church context, but also in a general context. If I'm part of an ethnic majority, whether in a country or at a church, I probably have some status. If I'm wealthy, I probably have a certain amount of status. If I believe generally what every person, what most people in here believe, whether it's about the Bible or about politics, whatever it is, if I believe the same thing that most people in here believe, I have some kind of status. If I have a title, if I have tenure, if I have friends or family in this room, I have status. If I make decisions for our church, then I have status. If people listen when I talk, especially when they don't have to, because I guess you kind of have to right now, right? If people listen when I talk, I have status. If I'm up here a lot, behind this pulpit, I have status. If I watch the same shows, or vacation in the same places, or went to the same schools, or wear the same brands, whatever it is, of other people with status, I probably have status. If I teach a Bible class even, I have status. If I have been to lectureships or to Bible school or to college in general, whatever it is, I have some level of status from that. Last thing I have, if I have the alarm code to this building, if I have door codes in this building, if I have a key to the bus, a key to the van, I have a certain level of status. And of all the things that I just listed, each of them obviously provides different levels of status or power, privilege, however we're putting this. And I'm not saying that this is the way that it should be, or the way that it always is. But in most cases where humans exist, we kind of divide ourselves up in this way, as people with and without status. And we have these very subtle, sometimes, ways of communicating that I'm a person with or without that status. If I'm a person with status, so much of my energy, so many of my choices in life, oftentimes, go to communicating that to other people. Now, holding that all in our minds, let's return to Romans 15 and begin in verse 2. Read the next couple of verses. Because whatever side of this I'm on, the status, the non-status, Paul says, let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself. Notice the thought process here. Act like this because Jesus didn't please himself. But as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. Now that's not fair. The reproaches of other people, like what other people have done, the consequences of that falling on me. That's not fair. Like I have echoes of my childhood self yelling about something with my siblings being unfair in my mind right now. And that never really goes away, right? We don't like being taken advantage of. We don't like giving and not receiving back. We don't like being run over by the big insurance company, right? Nobody likes that. It's not the way it's supposed to be. But we also know that this world isn't the way that it's supposed to be, right? And it's not going to be until Jesus comes back. And until then, we are called to walk in the way of Jesus. And the way of Jesus is taking on the reproaches of other people. The way of Jesus is giving and not receiving in return. The way of Jesus is, as Paul says it in Philippians, he was in the form of God, but he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus had status, he had power, he had privilege, but he saw something wrong in the world, and he lowered himself to build everyone else up. And what Paul is saying here in Romans 15 is be like Jesus. Don't let your comfortable social situation lull you to sleep. Don't let it blind you to the gaps that exist, even within the body of Christ. The gaps that exist where people are present. Now, specifically, he thinks that the obligation to bridge these gaps is on the people, at least in Rome, with social status, right? If you remember, back in the credits of Rome, Romans 16, where we started last week, remember that he's telling all these people, he says, greet this person, greet that person. There are more interesting things than we talked about last week that are present in this text. Romans 16, because notice that Paul doesn't directly greet people. He does that a lot, but he doesn't here. He's telling the people that he's writing to greet each other, right? That's a little bit different. But also remember that the main people he's writing to are the Gentile Christians. If you read through Romans, I think it's pretty clear that he's writing mainly to the Gentile Christians, to the strong of Romans 14 and 15. So he's telling the strong Christians, again, to take the first step, to greet their brothers and sisters. But also, this word translated greet doesn't just mean, hi, how's it going? Literally, it means to hug, which is obviously like we use words that literally mean something, but we use them in a different way, just as to metaphorically mean something. I think that's what he's doing here. But couple that with the fact in verse 16 that he says to greet one another with a holy kiss. So hugs and kisses, greet one another. He's telling them to treat each other like family, right? That's the point. That's the message that's coming across in Romans 16. Treat each other like family. I don't know about you. I have a family. Family's not always easy. Amen? Family is not always easy. Family is complicated sometimes. I have siblings. If you have siblings, you know, not always easy, right? If my siblings were here, they would tell you, it's not always easy being my sibling. They would be so happy to tell you that. Because sibling relationships are sometimes difficult. Sometimes more complicated than it feels like is worth it. But that's what he's calling them to be. He's calling them to be the unified, multi-ethnic family of God. Now, what we're doing here in church is taking that sibling dynamic and expanding it outside of our own family, outside of our own culture, outside of our own ethnic group. We're expanding it way more than it even is in the complicated family dynamics that we have, and trying to do it all together. This melting pot thrown all in of all kinds of different people. And it's going to be messy sometimes. But also, that's family. Family is like that. And to be a part of the family of Jesus means that I have an obligation to be a bridge builder, to be a peacemaker, to be a gap filler. Specifically, if I'm someone with status, Paul says it's on me to take the first step. It's on me to go first. In Romans 15, verse 7, he says, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Now, we've all been let in. We've all been welcomed into this family that we don't deserve. I mean, I'm pretty sure at least the vast majority of us in this room would fall under the Gentile category. We're not Jews. So we're doubly guests at this party, and undeserving guests at that. But we've been welcomed in. And it's our calling to do the same, especially if we have that status. And I'll be the first to say, this is not an easy road to walk. You know, I don't know about you, but when I'm talking with people who are different from me, which is literally everyone, but especially people who are very different from me, coming from very different backgrounds, sometimes I feel the weight of every word being, am I going to say something wrong, right? Am I going to offend this person when that's the last thing I want to do? That's a scary thing. Crossing these cultural boundaries is not easy. And that's why a whole lot of the New Testament is written specifically to address that. Because it's really hard when you bring people together who are different from each other. Now, look, I do not feel qualified to speak about this to y'all. I'll just tell you that. I'm 100% certain there are people in here who could correct several things that I've said about crossing these cultural boundaries in the last 20 minutes. I literally have 3 moments right now in my mind in the last week and a half that I've said something really dumb when trying to do stuff like this. So I'm not qualified to be up here. But I feel this weight from what little knowledge and experience I do have. I feel this weight that Paul places on us to be that bridge builder, to take that first step. So, as we're trying not to be like the world, because you may have heard of cancel culture. That's a pretty big thing in our society. There are good things about cancel culture, acknowledging the wrong things at work in our world, but also cancel culture is not the way of Jesus. And it's not the way that he wants us to operate in church. Because as we're trying to grow together, as Jesus is working in us, his Spirit is working in us to change us to people that can coexist in a helpful and healthy way. Let's be learners. Let's give each other space. Let's give each other grace. Let's give each other our best. No matter how many times it takes to get there, let's give each other our best. And let's welcome one another, just as Jesus welcomes us. That's what we're called to be and to do. Now, last kind of tangent I want to pursue with you is from this last phrase in Romans 15 and verse 7. Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Now, there's something intriguing there to me, because that's the language of worship, for the glory of God. It's the language of worship. And that ties in with some other things Paul says here. So let's read verse 6. Together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's, again, worship language. There's something special about lifting up all of these different voices from across our dividers, whatever they are. Something special about lifting up our voices as one voice in worship to God. And that's where Paul's going. All of this with the church and trying to help everyone to fit in together and all of this stuff from Romans is, and especially Romans 14 and 15, what we've been talking about, is building up to Romans 8 through 12. That's kind of the grand finale of what he's going for. And I'm going to put it on the screen. We're not going to read it all because there's a lot here that we're just not going to get because he's referencing a lot of Old Testament scriptures that we don't know. So we don't have time to kind of unpack all of it, but I want you just to skim through it and notice that of these quotations, I believe there are 4 here from the Old Testament. Notice in the first 3, the language of worship. If you're just skimming through, you'll see the word praise. You'll see the word sing, rejoice, extol. Now those are all worship words, right? Now when you get to the last quotation on the screen here, where he references Isaiah, there's something different about that. There's no worship language. It doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. He says, the root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope. That feels a little out of place if you're just reading through this, especially if you don't get what's going on. Because Paul does this thing a lot, where he quotes a line from the Old Testament. But he's not just quoting that one line. He's referring to the whole context surrounding that line, which is kind of a nightmare if you don't have the entire book of Isaiah memorized, right? Because there's a lot going on with this one line. But Paul, as the Hebrew or the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament scholar, nerd that he was, references this one line, and he's referencing the whole context around it. It's kind of like if I say, "it is well," just those words, they mean something to you, right? If you've been in church much at all in your life, you probably have some associations with that song. Or if I just all of a sudden just go, "ooh," then all y'all, if I kept doing it, all y'all Arkansas fans would have this impulse that you can't control to raise your arms, right? There's something about it where y'all lose control when those sounds come out. Something about it. So y'all know that one little sound, at least some of y'all got from a very brief moment what that was. So that's what Paul is doing. He's referring to the whole context with this one line. Thankfully, he is doing this because if he didn't, his letters would be like 10 times longer than they actually are. So, what is this reference all about here in Romans 14 and 15? Well, remember that he's trying to show them that all of this is bigger than my petty differences with other people, right? That's what he's trying to show them. He's trying to show them that something bigger is happening, that they have to come together in worship and fellowship across whatever is dividing them, to set aside that and to welcome one another as Jesus has welcomed them. And here at the end, he's saying that it's actually only when people who aren't like each other and people who might otherwise not like each other come together in worship and fellowship that the people of God are actually operating as the people of what God is doing on the or on our planet right now. Because he's quoting from Isaiah 11. And Isaiah 11 paints this picture of a world that's set right. A world where everything that's wrong with our world is better. And I want to read together verses 6 through 9. This is leading up to verse 10 is what he quotes in Romans 14. But just like picture this in your mind, what he's talking about. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb. That's not normal. Usually the wolf eats the lamb, right? And the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. That's a world set right. It's a world without fear. The cow and the bear shall graze together, is the implication. Their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra. And you young mothers, that's terrifying, right? But the world's set right. And the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, this is the image that Paul is evoking as he comes to the end of his thoughts here in Romans 14 and 15. As he's seeing these Jews and Gentiles coming together in a single body, he sees wolves and lambs coming together to worship, to participate in God's new big thing in the world, where he's setting it right. That's what he sees. That's what he has in mind for Romans 14 and 15, that as some of us are wolves, some of us are lambs, I don't know. You can identify whichever one you want to do. Whichever one you are, we're all coming together in one place to worship, to fellowship, to exist as just a small smidgen of God's big new thing in our world. And that's what the vision that Paul has. I want to leave you with this story. This is Brooks Ramsey, the guy on the screen. He's here with his wife. Now, Brooks Ramsey, one Saturday in the early 1960s, he was a preacher, and he was getting ready to preach the next day. He was a preacher at the First Baptist Church in Albany, Georgia, all-white First Baptist Church in Albany, Georgia. And this was in the middle of civil rights movement, and our nation had, obviously I wasn't alive then, but from what I've read, had a lot of, tension happening, right? Specifically in Albany. There's a lot of tension happening in this city. So on that Saturday, as he's getting ready to preach the next day, he receives word that 4 African Americans are planning to enter the all-white church that he preaches for the next morning with a prayer for reconciliation, or a plea for reconciliation. They were coming to do that. So he gets word, and he lets the deacons of his church know, and they meet, and he begs for them to let them in. So this preacher is begging the deacons of his church to let them in with this plea for reconciliation. And they're refusing. So Brooks Ramsey asks for a compromise. He says, can they at least go and watch it in this room to the side with the TV? And they won't let them in. So he says, well, at least if you won't let them in at all, we just not have them arrested. Just don't arrest them for trying to do this, to come into a public building. And they agreed to that, but they lied. So they called the police, and the police were there the next morning to arrest the 4 African Americans who were coming in with the plea for reconciliation. Now, following this, after they were arrested, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal had heard about this, and he asked Brooks Ramsey if he agreed with the actions of the deacons of his church. And he said that he didn't. And then he said something that was printed in newspapers across the country. He said, "This is Christ's church, and I cannot build any wall around it that he did not build. And that includes a racial wall." Not exactly necessarily profound, but powerful. It's not my church. I can't build any wall around it that Jesus didn't build. This applies to ethnic differences. It applies to all kinds of differences. Well, the deacons let Brooks Ramsey know that he was not supposed to preach the next Sunday, and he still did, but knowing his days there were numbered. And that is a moment, right, where he steps up and says, someone with status steps up and says, I can't put a wall here that Jesus hasn't put here. It's not always going to look that dramatic. That one's a pretty dramatic example. I think more often it looks like humbling myself and learning and growing and forgiving and trying and praying and hoping for a better tomorrow. I think that's what it looks like most of the time. It looks like regular people like you and me realizing the problems that we have and the ways that we treat each other that are not right, that are not okay, that are not the way of Jesus. And saying that I want to participate in whatever big thing God is doing in our world, that I want to be part of it. And that involves tearing down any walls that he hasn't put up. So, I don't know, I can't apply this sermon directly to you, but I hope there's something in it from the words of Paul that resonates with you. That in whatever ways I have status or power or privilege that you don't have, that I will take the first step to tear down the walls that our natural human self and our culture puts up between all of us. That I'd be the first one to take that step and the first one to tear a brick out of that wall. And I hope we're all doing that together. This morning, if you're new to Jesus, and if you live in Arkansas, you're probably not totally new to Jesus, but that is Jesus' way. Jesus' way is saying that all of this is bigger than me, that I'm willing to lower myself down to build everyone else up. And if that's a lifestyle that's appealing to you, I think it should be. I think it's the best way to live life. If that's a lifestyle that's appealing to you, we always, in every service, give everyone an opportunity to devote their life to Jesus. So if you would like to do that, you can come and talk to me down front as we stand and sing together.